Our current institutional crisis, per George Freeman. What is the federal government's relationship? At the end of the Depression and beginning of World War II, we needed, that is America, we needed a way to change the way our government interacted with the populace because we had a crisis, in this case, World War II. It was a crisis that compelled the government to interfere with every aspect of society because we needed total mobilization to win the war. Out of this gave the birth of the concept of the expert class, which would in turn give the birth of the technocracy that we know today. Now, at the time, circa late 30s, early 40s, these technocrats who were coming in, these experts, were actually very good at what they were doing. And not to say the new ones aren't, but the point is, the experts back then had a piece. They had their narrow piece of which they specialized in, but they also had the big concept of the whole. We need to win the war. We have to fight this evil, etc., etc., etc. From there, the core thing was that the federal government was allowed to intrude and arguably needed to intrude on all aspects of American life, the economy, the social life, whatever, right? Far, far beyond, went far, far beyond probably what the founders envisioned. It was responding to a crisis, but it still was going far beyond the vision. Now, as George Friedman notes, about 80 years later, we're kind of at the cycle where technocracy has basically fizzled out. Friedman brings in the concept of diffusion in the sense that you have multiple agencies within the federal government that war with each other. And you might have experts who are very, very good at their very, very narrow focus, a hedgehog, but they lack the piece that can see the whole. Or as Friedman would say, the experts, when they make their solutions and they make their models, the complexities of these models exclude the complexity of the whole, which basically means that the administrative state, it works, but it doesn't work at the same time. Think like the Affordable Health Care Act, again mentioned by Friedman, 10,000 pages, however long it was. I don't think, literally, I don't think anyone's actually read it. And when you look at this, you're just kind of scratching your head and saying, okay, well, I get this is meant to do something, but I just don't understand it. I get that you're trying or whatever, but whatever, right? Anyways, take this all forward to today. And this was a recent ruling that came out of the Fifth Circuit Court. Full defense, I'm not a lawyer. I'm doing my best to understand it. And so this is kind of the big picture here. Before I get into that, one more context from the legal precedent. One of the things that the expert system needed is that they needed Congress to devolve its authority to legislate to these executive agencies. Think like the ATF. Think like any three-letter agency that's been spun up since then. Or the SEC might be another example. These agencies will have their own in-house court system. So, for example, let's say you've got a very particular beef with the SEC or the ATF or whatever, right? Or the IRS. You can actually, the agencies themselves will have like an own internal, conflict resolution process, like their own internal court system. But the key in that is that you don't necessarily have the right, I believe, or it's hard, if it exists at all, to get a right to a trial by jury, which is something that's guaranteed as an American citizen. Like if you have a beef with the government or a beef with another person, you have the right to be heard by a jury of your peers. And the point here is that if you have some expert who's living off an expert land, the expert has to be able to clearly articulate the reason they're doing something. So like the expert at a three-letter agency, for example, has to be clearly and concisely able to articulate why they're doing something to a jury of, let's say, like 7 average Americans. And the point is, yeah, the expert might be very brilliant, the expert might be very smart, but if they can't explain the reason that the average, or at least 7, 9, however many people sit on a jury in such a situation would understand, then they're not going to be able to prevail. It forces the expert to come out of the ivory tower and come back down to the commoners if they have to deal with a jury system. That is if they are opposed by someone who's demanding a trial by jury. Anyways, with the administrative structure of these courts that go in through these, through the three-letter agencies, again, as I understand, this option isn't necessarily there, which means that there's no really check on the experts, which means that the experts can run away with the moon. And so going back into this ruling right here, so this is from John P. Collins on Twitter. Congress unconstitutionally delegated legislative power to the SEC by failing to provide an intelligible principle by which the SEC would exercise the delegated power in violation of Article 1's vesting of all legislative powers in Congress. So this was the big thing. And if the Fifth Circuit's court if this ruling is upheld by the Supremes, then I believe what this does is that this opens the door to a vast, if not attack, it calls into question all of the administrative law that's been made by these bureaucrats. Whenever you hear Gammon go off on a rant about, these unelected, Klaus Schwabs running around, like this is where they live. Like, not so much the Klaus Schwabs per se, but like the these courts that are enforced that you and I as American citizens and many others don't necessarily have a right to petition to. Now, I'm not trying to throw, just to be clear, I'm not trying to throw all experts under the bus. Experts are of course invaluable. We need them, right? So don't get me wrong on this. But at the same time, experts have to be able to explain in a way that us rubletons, as you would say, like understand. And the jury mechanism, right? Basically forcing to defend themselves by, in front of a jury of, their, 7, 9, however many people sit on a jury or whatever, right? It's a very good checksum. And more importantly, by taking, the administrative, like a review function out of the agency itself, if you leave the agency to be the check on the agency, there's a huge conflict of interest. It's like the fox guarding the hen house. Like, no, you want it to be completely out of the agency. So
how is everything changing now?
okay, so this is me like regurgitating some stuff. So bear with me here. Regulation. So here's the problem. You've got regulations and you've got laws. But when you have regulations that are masquerading as laws, which are enforced by the power of the three-letter agencies, Congress has effectively devolved its authority. So in other words, like the elective government or the people we elect, say whatever you want about them, might be bozos or whatever, right? But at least, we've elected them, right? Which should scare you even more, the people we can't elect that have even grander delusions to a power than our elected officials do. So by doing this, and this is to your point, when you have these people who are able to promulgate regulations and enforce the regulations without any pushback, that's the key thing. There's no effective mechanism to push back against these clowns. This is basically calling into question the concept of regulations being constitutional. In other words, it implies that they are not constitutional because only Congress has the power to pass laws, and there's nothing in the Constitution that allows them to abrogate those powers to another entity. So in other words, all of the regulations passed by federal agencies which have held the power of law are now called into question. So the Bureau of ATF, the Alcohol and Tobacco Firearms, DHS, HHD, DOE, Department of Education, just pick any three-letter agency you want, all part of the executive branch, all part of the administrative state, all part of, this a bunch of, hedgehogs, a bunch of Klaus Juniors, running around, waging war on the American population by just niddling them to death with regulation. Anyways, all of it was just called into question. If this is upheld, and remember, Josh, we have a Supreme Court that just created a draft. And not only did they create, they did, Roberts confirmed, not only did they create the decision, and then they leaked the pre-decision on Roe versus Wade. This suggests to me that the Supremes are definitely moving in the direction saying, hey, listen, we need to put a check on what's going on. Anyways, if this goes through, then what would happen is that if the SEC loses in this case, it would be a massive rebuke to the SEC and a massive rebuke to the entire administrative structure system that these rules and these regulations, niddle and whittle on, which means that, let's say that, example, you want to put up some sort of energy or desultanization plant or whatever, right? But the EPA comes in and says, nope, you can't do it because we have a regulation that says you can't do this for reasons X, Y, and Z. And what's more, if you disagree with us, you can come to our own in-house court where you can talk to our own in-house judge who's on our in-house payroll, and they will tell you you can politely go fuck yourself. In-house, of course. So by doing this, you can now sue back and say, oh, no. We're not playing that game. No. We're suing you. We're going to a real court with real juries. And if you bozos can't defend your position, if you guys can't come down off the mountain, you're going to have to basically retreat. And my suspicion is that these agencies know that if you have the scrutiny of the whole, like especially if you pick up like 7 people, say what you want about the jury system, but like picking 7 or 9 or whatever random people, like there's actually some wisdom. It's the wisdom of crowds, Josh. It's a microcosm of the wisdom of crowds. So Josh, like I think this is you're seeing me like think about this in real time, by the way. Like I'm still trying to wrap my mind around this, but like if you have a way for the average person to push back against the administrative state and you remove power from the administrative state, I see that as being a net plus and a major rebuke. Now, Josh, this is just the early stages. And like I said, there's quite a long road from here to, when it finally gets put into effect. But either way, like this might...
I absolutely hope so. There would be nothing better than if we could give pushback against all this jargon and regulation. I mean, there's so many issues. If you've ever tried to build a house in certain areas, I mean, just in Texas, so it's not too bad. But I mean, I'm in here in Massachusetts where it would be nearly impossible for you to make a profit on building a house if it is not a $1 million mansion, just by the way all the regulations are set up. If there was a self-fulfilling mechanism where the average person could give pushback on these regulations, it could provide a much freer market for everybody.
Yeah, and just to be clear, like I am not trying to throw experts under the bus here. I do love doing that, but like believe it or not, like let me argue the other side for a second, right? Like, look, you do need the experts. Like, so here's a good example, whatever, right? People like to villainize Fauci, and but setting my personal like opinions aside for the second, if you have a global pandemic that's sweeping across that you don't know what the effect is, like, listen, even I will concede, about 2 weeks to shut things down, out of an abundance of caution, that probably makes sense. You don't know what you're dealing with. Yes, this is probably a good first response. But, and this is where the experts fail, it can't be an ongoing, sustained response to it or whatever, right? Yes, it is true we want to save as many people as we possibly can, but you always, the hat tip to gammon, you always have to ask the question, at what cost? If you force kids to stay home, okay, well, you might be protecting kids from the virus. That is good. But at the same time, are you exposing kids to other potential issues by not having them be able to socialize, not being able to run around? Like, what are we built like? If this is what we're getting over here, what are we paying for over here to get it? And this is where you get into this horrible, calculation, because basically it's a version of, well, who lives and who dies. My argument is that we have to make these calculations. Refusing to make a decision is, or just sticking your head in the sand, is making a decision in of it. Like indecision is a decision in of itself. So if you have Fauci who's having to defend the position of, let's say, like, wearing masks, and obviously the mask has passed, but let's say this is like, Q3 of 2021. If you have an administrator who has to come out and say, like, well, look, here's our data, point number one, point number two, point number three. And more importantly, it forces the administrator to hear things that they might not otherwise want to hear. Well, like, listen, Dr. Fauci, we completely get what you're saying. We completely get your numbers, but consider these facts over here. Suicide rates have increased. Socialization's gone down. The Zooms are acting even weirder than they already are, or whatever, right? And so you're able to drag this into the public discourse, and you can see, okay, well, listen, both people are kind of right. Both people have their point. Josh, the worst problems in life to solve are the ones where there's no clear angle. Like you're gonna piss off someone, or at least if you piss off everyone, everyone's pissed off. But like when you have something that can't be reconciled, like in this particular situation, you probably want to kick it over to the court of public opinion and have like the public tug of war, because that'll show you it's like the market. It's like the market of ideas. Finding the price point in a sense. This is what I see. This is opening the door to. And let me just read one more quote here. So the U.S. system is divided into subcourts that decide matters within the area of jurisdiction. For example, if a plaintiff disputes the Social Security Administration's decisions, then the claim will be adjudicated by the Federal Administration's law judge rather than by a jury trial. Did you catch that? Let me read that again or whatever, right? So you have to deal with a federal admin law judge rather than the jury trial with Joe Bob and Bobby Joe having the final say. And that's the point, is that what it does is that you can't have an expert, you can't have a technocrat be the arbiter of deciding do we or do we not want the technocratic solution to go through. And just to be clear, perhaps at times you do want the technocratic solution to go through, but you don't want the final say to be another technocrat. You want it to be reduced down, I think, back to the crowd, back to the jury or whatever.
And what we were talking about is, what is the government's relationship to itself? Everything is potentially going to change within the next few years, because that question has to be answered. This is one way how everything is potentially going to change. If we get the judicial system down and right, then that could be on the path, on the right direction. Is there any last thoughts, Justin?
No, like I said, I mean, like, obviously, like I said, as you can tell from watching this, I by no means am a lawyer, and my understanding of this is, incredibly sparse. But either way, I do like the idea of having the average citizen being able to directly petition and demand that the technocracy explain themselves in a way that like a group of my peers would also understand. And if they can't do that, then my attitude is, no, they need to be checked. Not necessarily rebuked, but checked.